Lights are bright.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. I'd like to thank the conference organizers for giving us a chance to have a really timely discussion about cybersecurity. My name is Eli Sugarman. I manage cybersecurity policy grant making for the Hewlett Foundation. And I'm very excited to introduce to you our wonderful panelists today. To your right, we have Alex Stamos, Chief Information Security Officer at Yahoo. He's responsible for helping to secure Yahoo's over 1 billion monthly users. Next to him, we have Undersecretary Suzanne Spalding from the Department of Homeland Security. She oversees the National Protection and Programs Directorate and really helps lead a lot of their cybersecurity efforts. Next, we have Ray Rothrock, the CEO of Red Seal, and an experienced cybersecurity investor. He's invested in over 18 cybersecurity companies. And last but not least, we have Susan Gilchrist, CEO of the Brunswick Group, a strategic communications firm that has helped multiple companies deal with breaches and respond once they've suffered an attack. So in the past few days, we've had quite a few news stories about cybersecurity. We hear about multiple new laws being considered in the US Congress. We hear about the Department of Defense issuing a new strategy. We've also heard that President Obama's emails were penetrated by Russian hackers. And so I think I'd like to get started with one of the more timely policy issues right now, which is information sharing. Right now, there are several different pieces of legislation pending in Washington, and it's also an issue being discussed across the pond. And I'd like to ask Alex, what are your views about information sharing? How important is it for companies to voluntarily share information, threat signatures about malware and the like, both amongst themselves and with government? Do you think this is actually a really critical way to keep companies safe online? Or is it more one of the low-hanging fruits where there's bipartisan consensus, and that's why we're focused on it?
Thanks, Eli. Thanks to the Milken Institute for having us. Information sharing is very, very important, critical especially against advanced attackers, because a shocking number of people who do this professionally for other governments reuse the same techniques and technologies and even command and control channels for multiple victims. The issue I have with the information sharing bill is the industries that would most benefit are already doing this. So in the tech industry, we have a group called the Bay Area CISO Council. We have a APT working group. We have a technology platform called Threat Exchange that we've all worked on together and that's hosted by Facebook. And so we're already doing information sharing on an automatic basis and working with each other pretty directly. The information sharing bills in Congress don't really do anything for us. Like, our lawyers have never said, you can't do that because we don't have protection. And so it does seem to be, because it's easy to do information sharing and it's something you can get through a bipartisan support, that's all of our focus. But honestly, of the top 10 things I'd have the government do, that's maybe number 12.
Okay. Okay. Well, let me turn to Ray. You've worked with smaller companies. Obviously, Yahoo is one of the largest, most skilled technology companies that has a budget to hire Alex and his team and really put in place robust safeguards. I'm curious about information sharing and how it pertains to smaller companies, which are the vast majority of companies out there, and sort of the differences between sort of the Fortune 500 and frankly everybody else. And would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Sure. Well, one of the things about a small company is they don't have the resources. They can't get the talent. The engineers are scarce. And so they have to resort to sharing or some sort of access to information. I did an investment in a company called Cloudflare in the Bay Area, and their whole market focus was on the long tail, the other than 500, Fortune 500 companies. And their sharing is actually quite effective. They share with many of the things that Alex mentioned, but they also have a worldwide network that monitors traffic. And so when they see a problem pop up in Sweden, they can apply what they've learned there to all the other access points to the 20 million customers that they have globally. So in some sense, they're actually prevent attacks against smaller companies. They do other things for the small companies, but that sharing is a really critical piece of Cloudflare's strategy.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Ray. I'd like to turn and sort of build off something that I think both you and Alex touched upon, which is the role of government, and specifically the federal government here in the United States, which plays a very critical role in keeping companies and individuals safe online. And Undersecretary Spalding, I'd love for you to explain to us in the audience how the government conceives of its responsibilities. What is the mission of the Department of Homeland Security when it comes to cybersecurity? And I think one way to really explain that to everybody and the role of the department, the role of the FBI, and then other government entities is perhaps to walk us through an example. Let's assume a large company X contacts the department and says, we've been breached, we need help. Or perhaps you're given information that you're then able to share to notify the company. Help us explain sort of the role of government and how you interface with the private sector.
Great, happy to do that. So in either of those instances, and of course those kinds of incidents come to our attention in both those ways, either from a victim company who has detected it, but really more often than not, the companies don't detect it themselves, and it comes to us through other means. It comes to us either through law enforcement, or it might come to us through the intelligence community, or through a company that's monitoring, for example. And so we will then reach out to that company, but we will also reach out to our partners in government. And so generally speaking, we will talk to our colleagues across the interagency to see what they know. And we will together determine what resources we can bring to bear to help the situation. So in our case, at the Department of Homeland Security, we have a very distinct mission. We have some law enforcement in the Secret Service, but the organization that I lead is the National Protection Programs Directorate. We have the responsibility for strengthening the security and the resilience of our nation's critical infrastructure against both physical and cyber threats. And so all of those things that sustain our way of life, and you think immediately of transportation and electricity, but it also includes financial services and water, 16 different sectors that we worry about, commercial facilities, critical manufacturing. And so we have relationships there that we've developed over the years. And so we'll reach out to those companies and ask if they would like assistance. We go in at their request, pursuant to a request for technical assistance. We help them to understand what it is that may be going on in their system, to mitigate those consequences, and then, if they request, to help them rebuild in a way that is more secure. So that is the role that DHS plays, as distinct from a primarily law enforcement or intelligence attribution role.
Okay. Just to follow up, one of the interesting new government pronouncements in the past week was Secretary of Defense Carter's speech at Stanford and the new policy that he rolled out, explaining, I think, much more clearly than in the past, the role of the military. And much has been talked about, the militarization of cyberspace. It's obviously great to see a civilian agency playing the key role for the US government. Could you help us understand under what circumstances an attack rises to the level potentially where resources beyond just those of DHS need to be brought in, and how does the government identify where that line is?
So this is the same kind of analysis that we have always done in the context of physical attacks as well. And so the president makes a determination when the first avenue, of course, is to civilian resources and capabilities. And if the president makes a determination that we've exceeded the capacity of our civilian resources and capabilities, we might request support and assistance from the Department of Defense. And that can take any number of avenues. But that's basically the escalation and the determination that would be made. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And I might just touch on the information sharing that was discussed earlier. I completely agree that information sharing is critically important. I describe it as necessary but not sufficient. And it is absolutely the case that there's an awful lot of information sharing going on today where companies don't feel the need for liability protection. Having said that, we have heard from companies who have expressed concerns about this and who have indicated that they would share more readily if they had some very targeted liability protections. I think one of the reasons we're making advances legislatively in a Congress that has not been well known for passing legislation is that we have made it a point to not be too ambitious. And so where we started with this comprehensive cybersecurity bill a couple of years ago that included everything that we could think of that could help us advance this very important mission, we've realized that it's important to at least take advantage of those areas where there is consensus and make the advances that we can make even in this time of challenges with regard to Congress.
Okay, so picking up on the importance of consensus, let's focus a little bit on the global aspects of that consensus, or lack thereof. And Susan, given your seat in London and the global purview of your company and assisting firms who are grappling with how to manage some of these threats and then also respond to them, I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of both information sharing, but then more broadly, interfacing and interacting with government, and whether or not lack of trust perhaps inhibits some companies, and how you counsel them on thinking about those issues.
Okay, it's a good question. We have about 850 clients all around the globe, so we have a very interesting sort of sight line into the way companies in different countries are thinking. And I think that there are some things that are the same, and there are some things that are very different. And I think one thing that is the same is that all companies are recognizing we're operating in a new normal. This whole cyber threat issue is only going to increase, not decrease, and companies need to adapt to that and be agile. And I think one of the really big changes that's happened in the last year or two is how much this issue has risen up the leadership agenda, the board agenda, and it's something that CEOs really need to take ownership of. And I think it's probably most advanced in the US, but other companies are catching up. And I think CEOs are realizing that they need to do a number of things. They, first of all, need to get educated, get smarter on the subject. They definitely need to invest, both in the security equipment, but also in the skills. They definitely need to prepare for that day, should the day come when there's a crisis, and cyber crisis, and they need to respond. And I think one of the really big things is they need to try and develop a security awareness culture, because often it's people, not just software, that's going to be the weak link. And just one person opening a phishing email can cause all kinds of damage. So how does leadership actually integrate computer security into the management and the culture of the business? But then there are many differences. And it's very hard, I think, for multinational corporations to navigate, because there are different regulations in different parts of the world, and there are very different cultural attitudes in different parts of the world. I've had the privilege of living in the US for the last 5 years, so I really understand the sort of the sense of personal freedom, sense of privacy you have here. But if you go to countries in Europe where terrorism is on the doorstep, in my country, in Britain, a couple of years ago, we had a soldier macheted to death in a street in London. If you live in Paris, you've seen the Charlie Hebdo attacks. And I think what that does is that means that the citizens of those countries have a very different attitude towards what governments need to do to protect them against terrorism. And then Germany is different because of their history, and then China is completely different again. And I think navigating this environment is incredibly difficult for companies, and they actually need government's help to almost assist in the sort of rise of data nationalism, for want of a better word. It's tough.
No, thank you for teeing up that issue. I think data nationalism is actually a really important issue, and its interconnectedness with national security. So why don't I come back to you, Alex? I mean, Yahoo is a global corporation. It has over 1 billion, monthly users. And so presumably you have customers in pretty much any country on Earth, and you have to navigate a lot of the complexities that Susan just spoke about. And so, can you give us some real-life examples of how Yahoo has had to adjust its business focus or practices to take into account some of those jurisdictional conflicts, different views of security and privacy, some of the trade-offs that really do confront business that help, bring it home a little bit?
So one of the challenges we have is to keep our users secure against the 99% of users that have normal everyday problems without reducing the safety of the 1% that have really significant problems, like they're under investigation by a PI hired by a competing firm, or they live in a country where their democracy activism is not appreciated. And so it is a real challenge to try to build technology that works in every country, that fits to the local cultural expectations, and then doesn't create weird security issues. So for example, one of the things we try to do a lot, well, this might be embarrassing, but who here has a Yahoo account? I'd be interested to see. Oh, great. So who here, is it just for fantasy football? I'd be interested. Yeah, a couple. So, to create a Yahoo account, one of the things we require now is we require you have a mobile phone number verified with us. And that's because the number one risk any user faces that we have thousands of users face per day is account takeover because they've reused their password in different places. So we find we have intelligence agents that go and speak many languages, and they infiltrate the underground, and they'll go buy username and passwords off the underground. And we usually find that 10 to 15% of a US-centric dump will have yahoo.com addresses and a password that matches, right? And so we'll go do this, we'll buy this information, and now we know there's 17 million users who are exposed, and we need to do something to keep them safe. And to reestablish trust between us and that user, the best way to do that is through a verified phone number. That causes a lot of trouble in other situations. For example, if you're a democracy activist in Hong Kong, we had interesting issues during that time where Flickr was being blocked because photos are being uploaded and such. If the government controls the local phone network, then us allowing you to reset your password because we send you a text message is extremely dangerous for you individually. And so there really is there's no normality between the governments of what is acceptable of how to treat people in cyberspace, right? Like we have ideas of how police should treat folks. We have ideas of what is considered a fair legal process, and those are certainly not applied equally, but at least you could start the discussion, and there's not even the start of that discussion yet of what is allowed, how much you can spy on your citizens, what can you do with that information, what they have to turn over if they cross a border. And because of that, it puts the tech companies in a position where we need to make the choices that keep people safe as much as possible and keep their data secure as much as possible, and then handle requests for data through the MLAT process, the legal process that allows countries to request information across borders under either bilateral or multinational agreements.
Okay. No, I think that's really helpful to understand. And I think, building a little bit about what Susan was saying in terms of the European reaction to data security, privacy in the wake of very unfortunate terrorist attacks of late. Undersecretary Spalding, obviously the US continues to grapple with terrorist threats, and obviously in the post 9/11 world, reorganized bureaucratically, passed many new laws, created a new balance between privacy, security, the role of government, so on and so forth, that we continue to debate. I'm curious sort of about your interactions with your global partners, and especially those in Europe, in France and the UK and Germany, and what are some of the salient lessons that you share with them, and how do you support their ongoing efforts to secure their citizens? But then also, what lessons do you share as far as how to interact with companies who also have to deal with these very complex environments, wanting them to succeed and also help people stay safe online?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I spent many years working counterterrorism issues and now working cyber issues since about the mid-90s. And so I do see a lot of the connections there and the parallels. One of the things that came home to us in the counterterrorism world was the fact that it transcended borders, the threat, and that we had to come together to meet the challenge. And that is obviously even more the case with regard to cyber, where there really are no boundaries. And so we work very closely on a daily basis with our international partners around the world. Our primary operational group, our National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, pronounced NCIC, that's our 24/7 operations center, and they have a CERT, a Computer Emergency Readiness Team, and they interact with other computer emergency readiness teams all across the country, all across the world, excuse me. We've helped set up CERTs around the world, and we interact with them. We do information sharing. We share operational best practices, but we're also working at the policy level in terms of sharing best practices for how we interact with our companies, with the critical infrastructure sector, how much, different countries vary on how much is voluntary and how much they're going to mandate in terms of cybersecurity, and we have robust discussions around those, around best practices, and we have a cybersecurity framework. The UK has Cyber Essentials. But we all have various kinds of best practices we've put out, and then campaigns to reach individuals to help them improve their own cybersecurity. And so we work with the EU, we work with the usual five. We have lots of different groups with whom we interact on the international level, recognizing that all of us are only as strong as our weakest link.
Right. Okay. I'd like to transition now and ask you, Ray, actually about Another key player in this debate, and I think many people in the audience probably consider themselves investors and are investors. And what is the role of the investor in helping companies put in place a culture of security, like Susan mentioned? How can they drive corporate leadership and interface with the C-suite to explain the importance of risks and also promote adequate investment? I think even very large venture-backed companies like Airbnb and Uber only recently appointed their first chief information security officer, CISOs. And so in an environment like that, having seen so many companies from the investor side, would love to sort of get your thoughts about the role of the investor and how you push this internally.
It's actually pretty easy to push because the economics are extremely compelling. On the slide there now, the latest data I could collect up was $455 billion of losses in the United States alone. That's about 3% of the GDP, just a little less, which is not an insignificant number. Only $71 billion of money was spent to defend that 455. So the economics becomes, that's about a 6-to-1 ratio there. The other piece of it is, in my company, Red Seal, we did a survey that confirmed what we'd been hearing from a lot of people. We talked to 350 C-level executives, and a cyber Pearl Harbor, which I'm frequently asked about, would be a horrible thing, and maybe it's in the works or something. But really, what's eating at these executive suites is the tax that cybersecurity is putting on these small companies that don't have the ability to defend themselves. I mean, it's one thing to put in a sprinkler system to prevent a fire, but how do you prevent the loss of revenue? Cybersecurity can create the loss of revenue and the confidence that a customer has in a particular company. I mean, JP Morgan spends $250 million a year and they're still in the newspaper. Why is that? So it's not a difficult discussion. What is hard is the vocabulary. I mean, the CISOs, with all due respect, Dallas, show up and talk about zero-day attacks and all that. And the CEO doesn't care about that. He just wants to know, he wants some measures. He wants some stuff that he can hang his teeth on, hang his reputation on, that my network is getting better. I'm taking precautions. There's these measurements. One of the things that's not been talked about much, and I would encourage the DHS to think about this, is to come up with some metrics. This building was built with standards. Networks were not built with standards. And we're not going to solve this problem unless we can measure, create standards, and have the ability to respond when these things occur. So the conversation is easy, but when you get around to actually implementing it, it's a lot harder than it looks.
So picking up on that and turning to you, Undersecretary Spalding, how would you respond to that? And do you think that some of the recent government efforts, such as the NIST framework from the Department of Commerce, which is supposed to help start providing a framework in which companies can identify their risk and then sort of scale the right solutions. What is government doing to help smaller companies with limited resources really sort through what their footprint should be trying to defend?
Yeah, we at the Department of Homeland Security feel a particular obligation to small and medium-sized businesses. So in addition to the incident response, which we've discussed, a huge part of our mission is to get that information out. So when we talk about information sharing, it's not just please give the government information. It is really about wanting to get information out very broadly to all of our stakeholders. And our stakeholders include the private sector, but also state, local, and territorial and tribal governments who are really struggling with this cyber threat, as well as the civilian government, the .gov. And so we are all about getting that information out broadly, but also building the capacity for folks who then get that information to do something with it. And the cybersecurity framework is a tremendously helpful tool in that regard. And it stops short of setting standards or even really specific metrics, because it understands both how dynamic this environment is, how innovative our enemies are, and the changes in technology, but also that there's no one-size-fits-all in terms of what works for a company.
Right.
So what the framework gives you is a way of thinking about this and approaching this problem that starts with assessing your own risks within your own company. What is it that you want to protect? What is it that an adversary might be able to access? That might be customer information, it might be intellectual property, proprietary data, it might be your industrial control systems. But whatever it is, you need to figure out what that is. And then you need to develop a plan for protecting that, for identifying, for detecting when you've had a penetration or a breach, for responding to that, and for recovering, right? And that's basically it for the cybersecurity framework. And then it gives you a whole list of best practices and standards. What it says is figure out where you are today, figure out where you want to be, and come up with a plan to get from A to B. We have at the Department of Homeland Security something we call C3VP. It stands for Critical Infrastructure Cyber Communities Voluntary Program. Go to dhs.gov/cyber, dhs.gov/cyber, and there's a whole host of resources available to try to help particularly small and medium-sized businesses, but really everyone, to be able to use the framework, and a whole host of assessment tools, et cetera, all free of charge, to try to help folks to lift their cyber hygiene, as we call it.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
no, I will go check out that website.
My shameless plug.
I mean, I like, as the Undersecretary said, it's nice that the cybersecurity framework is not too prescriptive, because it's basically a taxonomy that allows you to speak about things and to give you the list of all things you can think of. But if we get too prescriptive, we end up with a very fragile system. So the most successful and the most horrible security standard in the world is a thing called the PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Digital Security Standard. So that's a requirement that the credit card oligopoly puts on anybody who takes credit cards. And so it's been incredibly successful in that tons of businesses have had to do security work that would never have thought about it before, because they took a credit card and all of a sudden they have to get a penetration test, they have to get an audit, they have to have all kinds of things done to pass the test. The downside is it's so prescriptive that people now aim to hit PCI and nothing more. And you need to remember that every time you go and you open up the Wall Street Journal and it says X retailer had 150 million credit cards stolen, that retailer was PCI certified, right? And so the PCI Council likes to go and be like, oh, no true Scotsman could ever be broken into. They were clearly not really PCI certified, and retroactively, but honestly, Target, Home Depot, all those people passed their test. Right. And that's what happens when you have a really specific guidelines.
You set the floor.
Shoot down for it, and then they ignore all the other stuff they can do, and they also ignore, if you're dealing with, this is the difference between like your standard kind of day-to-day threats and like your nation-state threats. When you're dealing with the nation-state threats, it's about speed and flexibility and the ability to detect quickly and move quickly to kick somebody out. It's not about, I have my checklist that I've done. If you want to win in a battle against an attacker who has an infinite amount of time and who doesn't necessarily want to go after only your most valuable assets or for dollar figures.
Right, okay, so Ray, I think you wanted to...
Just really, actually, it's a very good point, and I love the cyber framework. We jumped on it immediately when it came out in February. The one thing I'll say about all that PCI stuff is that typically is on some sort of cycle time of 30 days, 90 days, even a year, depending upon lots of other variables. The problem is the network is dynamic. This building is fixed. Those doors aren't going to move. The ceiling is going to stay at a certain height. A network is very different. The doors move, the windows move, the ceiling changes, the room shape even changes. And it does that on a daily basis. So you need a lot of technology and automation and some sort of measures that come up and say, oh, something's changed over here. My PCI is no longer compliant. So that's an opportunity, all the VCs out there, this is an opportunity to jump on that bandwagon, because you need a measure to know if it's changed for the better or for the worse. And just one other thing. So I live up in Northern California. My house is literally about 1,000 feet from the San Andreas Fault. And I run the town's emergency preparedness committee. And it's one thing to have a plan. It's one thing to have standards and equipment and the shelves and all that stuff. But it's a whole other thing to actually run drills. And that is what happens after the fact. You're in the drill business, right? Not only do you have to know what to do, but you got to have practice, and practice makes perfect. And actually, practice I have seen in my little town, it makes everybody's, oh, that fire extinguisher could fall off the wall, or something could change. But if you run a drill, you know it won't. So when I'm asked, what's the big thing you can do? Run your firewalls better and run drills.
Okay.
Yeah, can I pick up on that point, actually? I think that's absolutely right. And what's really interesting is, we often run sort of crisis response and crisis training and simulations. And, a little while ago, they always used to be about something like a big sort of equipment failure or a natural disaster. 90% of them now are on this issue. And people are trying to think, okay, what will we do? And I think when you look at when these issues go badly or when they go well, I think there are a couple of things that differentiate them. The first is is the senior team involved? Isn't just the IT team and legal, are the senior leadership involved in that crisis simulation or that actual crisis response? And when you look at some of the ones that have gone very public, the ones that have gone well are often because the companies really thought about it from the customer's point of view and really focused in on what the customer needed to know. They didn't sort of go trying to make sort of estimates of how many people have been breached. They went to what the customer needs, feels, and focused on those issues. And I think the really important thing is that when these things happen, it's very tempting to think legally and what are my legal obligations, but I think this sort of stuff is a reputational issue. And companies, consumers in the future are going to deal with companies they trust, and therefore how you deal with it from a reputational point of view is really critical. Don't just think legal, think reputational, and think about your values and talk about those too. And that's what's going to get you through, in for many cases, the inevitable breach, because things like Sony, things like Target, they're not one-offs. There's going to happen again.
Turn the CEO's email off for a couple of days.
Yeah.
Tell him that's what happens in a breach.
So let's build off that, right? I mean, and so you cited some statistics, Ray, that suggested that it's essentially a no-brainer for companies to invest in more robust cybersecurity infrastructure. Yet you still have the Harvard Business Review publishing articles saying that if you look at the impact on share price of publicly traded companies that have been breached, such as Target, there really isn't a significant impact over time. And there are other indicia that suggest that actually market forces may not drive companies to invest as much as they should. And so I'm curious what you think about the role of tort liability, for instance, or other insurance, the insurance market, and other ways that you take traditional means of influencing the market and changing incentive structures such that they align with better cyber hygiene and encouraging companies to follow best practices.
So to do that, you need to do lots of measuring, right? An insurance company has to underwrite. They want to, they look at your driving record to give you auto insurance. So what are they going to do on cyber?
Yeah.
What are they going to do? What are they going to dispatch 100 people to go in and sweep through it, and then tomorrow the network changes? So there needs to be some agreement about what matters. And to the Harvard Business, so that's one thing, and a lot of people are working on these elements in order to get cyber insurance. If you were to get a policy, any CEOs had to get a policy, you're covered in about this much of the universe of your business, so they're not that useful. The Harvard Business, I read that too, and I would just say over time, I think their time frame is too short.
Okay.
And in fact, the CEO was on CNBC this last holiday season sort of complaining about how they didn't have as many customers, the cash register wasn't ringing as often. Now that'll ripple through ultimately, so I just think it's a matter of time.
Okay.
And it's so right, it's just, these aren't isolated incidents.
Okay.
These are just the ones that are in the newspaper.
Right.
What about, I've got 200 customers of my company, and most of them are not in that business of being reported, but they've had breaches.
Right.
And I think the landscape is changing. Like everything else we're talking about, the legal landscape is changing as well. I think one of the things that the cybersecurity framework is going to begin to do is to help establish a prevailing standard of care. One of the reasons that we were not able to make a grand bargain last year with regard to cybersecurity exchanging liability protection for something that began to look to the industry like regulation was because they did not fear liability, because courts have generally not found companies liable because judges don't feel that they know what the standard of care is. What is the standard? What could someone do to have prevented this breach? If it's not a compliance checklist standard, what is it? And I think the cybersecurity framework will begin, I don't know how long it will take, but it will begin to change that. And as courts begin to feel more confident and hold companies liable, I think that will drive. On the insurance market, I will say we've been working for the last few years on trying to promote a more robust cybersecurity insurance market. Third-party insurance is more robust because we have data breach notification laws. So if your customer's information has been stolen, you must tell them. There's a whole, it's state by state, and we're trying to make a national regime to make it easier for companies. But there's a series of things you must do. You know how much that's going to cost. First-party insurance, your reputational harm, your eventual harm to your, in terms of customer confidence, et cetera, much harder to calculate. Those also are not reported. Companies don't have to report it. They'd just as soon not have anybody know. So one of the things that we've been talking to the industry about is, could we create a third-party, neutral place where incident information would be reported and anonymized? To begin to create a database, an actuarial table, if you will.
Yeah.
And my thought is, frankly, that database should be made public. Researchers should have access to it. Every insurance company, anybody else who wants to get access to that information, it would be helpful for a whole host of reasons. But one is to help to begin to promote what is really essential, which is a robust insurance market.
So, I mean, two things. I think I love the idea of the sharing information. That's what NASA Ames does with airline safety.
Yeah.
And that's been super helpful for the airlines. This discussion gets very concerning for two reasons. One, I love lawyers. Lawyers are good people. Many of my best friends are lawyers. My brother's a lawyer. I don't need any more lawyers in my life. That wouldn't make my job any better, right? Like getting plaintiffs' attorneys
There's
involved.
a but coming here, though, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's all of these metaphors of where other regulations have worked about, I build a bridge in an earthquake zone to code. The thing is geologists can predict what a 25-year, 50-year, 100-year, 1,000-year earthquake is, and we can model what that situation is, and we can build rules that give you a reasonable chance of surviving that. I have no idea what the 25-day attack is against Yahoo. I have no idea what's going to happen. And so if we start to try to assume that we can predict what's going to happen in the next 5 years based upon the history, when a bridge is built against gravity, which doesn't change, and with laws of physics that don't change, but the laws of cybersecurity change every single day. The attacks that we defend against right now were not invented yet 2 years ago, right? I have people testing for bugs that we wrote in code 5 years ago, but there's no way we could have prevented it because the entire idea of those kinds of attacks were not invented yet. And so to build a government infrastructure that incentivizes the companies to aim for something when the attackers are doing this is different. We're not building bridges, we're playing chess. And you can't regulate you're a good chess player, right? Like there's no standard, chess playing framework that I can learn. You have to practice, and you have to understand what your adversary's abilities are, and you have to be fast on your feet. That's the key. And so I think if government's going to do work in this space, it's got to really think about, am I slowing folks down? Am I telling the business people to tell the tech people to do things that perhaps sounded great at this time, but mean nothing in 6 months?
Okay. So sort of building off what you said, Alex, let's talk a little bit about encryption, which traditionally has been one of the most effective means of...
I gotta go, I'm sorry.
most effective means of...
I'm the one who's supposed to say that, I thought.
No.
So encryption has really enabled, in part, the internet to take off as a commercial vehicle, right? Without encryption, banking transactions would not be possible online. People would not trust Yahoo or potentially other platforms where they send sensitive data. And so on the one hand, commerce, free speech, people connecting. On the other hand, there are criminals. There are bad actors out there who do use the internet to commit crimes, and they use encryption to cover their tracks or to make their communications not open to the good guys, right, trying to stop them. And so, and as a result of that latter fact, government, in particular FBI Director Comey and others, have come out very strongly in favor of a solution that will allow US government in this instance to have access to otherwise encrypted secure communications. And so I'd love to hear from you, Undersecretary Spalding, sort of how you come at this issue, because I think DHS is in a particularly interesting situation. On the one hand, helping companies and individuals stay safe, but then on the other hand, you have the Secret Service, who are a law enforcement agency. And so I'd love to hear sort of your thoughts on encryption and the ongoing public debate.
Yeah, well, our Secretary Jay Johnson was at the RSA Cybersecurity Conference last week as a keynote speaker and talked about the fact that the department is in a unique position for precisely the reasons that you state. And so we really do understand, I think, the concerns on both sides and the perspectives on this issue across the spectrum. Absolutely no question that strong encryption is good for security. Good for security generally, it's certainly good for cybersecurity. And there's no question that we're operating, our companies are operating in a global marketplace, and they're not the only providers of these kinds of equipment. And so there's a limit to how much we can prevent, even if we made a policy decision that the right answer is to try to prevent technology that's out there that cannot be accessed in any way for lawful purposes. The degree to which we could impose that around the world, right? And so we understand the limitations here and the business reasons, the impact on U.S. company market shares, for example, et cetera. By the same token, as you say, we are also very aware that it's not just the Secret Service, but also ICE, our Homeland Security Investigations, who does tremendous men and women who work every single day to identify people who are preying on children and bring them to justice and protect those children, whose ability to conduct that kind of investigation will be impacted by this. And so what we are trying to do is encourage a public conversation. And the reason that the Secretary raised it at RSA is we had 25,000 really smart, innovative people there who need to help us come to a decision, a consensus, a decision about how we as a country and as a world want to move forward on this. So we're looking for, I think we need to talk about this and find ways to think about it that don't send people to their usual corners. I talk about how we need to find a way to talk about this that confuses people. So that they aren't quite so sure right away which corner they go to. But in any event, we need to see if we can, and we talk about this as if it's all one technology. It's a range of technologies, some of which I think are easier to address in this context than others. And we need to sort of work our way through it. And then we need to have this public understanding that if we're going to make these trade-offs, that we are, in fact, making this decision, and we're making it in a conscious way.
Okay. So before I come to Alex, who I know has very strong views on this, let me turn to Susan. And Undersecretary Spalding rightly emphasized the global nature of this debate and sort of the technology is spread globally. So I'm really curious for your views how you're seeing this debate play out, both the perceptions of it in the United States, but then also how it's being discussed overseas, given that it is an issue that other governments are very actively grappling with as well.
Well, if you're sitting in Europe, I think that people think certain US tech companies are being tone deaf on end-to-end encryption. For all the reasons I said earlier about the kind of different attitudes. But I think essentially what companies really need to do is there's a kind of spectrum from total privacy on one end to sort of very stringent law enforcement and oversight on the other. And it's going to vary, actually, to be honest, from sector to sector. So a utilities company who's got critical infrastructure will be more at this end of the spectrum, and a healthcare company with a lot of private information will be more at that end of the spectrum. But I think companies need to decide where they're going to be on that spectrum, and can they be there and put hand on heart and say, I am still a good corporate citizen. And I think that's a really important piece of the debate. And I think, as I said before, in Europe, where there are more sort of threats of terrorism on the doorstep, that I think that attitude to what being a good corporate citizen is a little bit different.
Okay. So Alex, I've heard you say some, pretty forward-leaning things in the past about
forward-leaning, is that
encryption. I'm trying to be diplomatic.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
One recalls in a particularly public exchange you had with the head of the NSA only a few months ago. And so I'd love your perspective, especially given your technology background, but then also realizing that in the 1990s, a somewhat similar debate played out in the United States, the so-called crypto wars. And I'm curious what has changed between now and then that sort of has brought this back to the forefront, and we can also, I'm sure the government has an interesting view as well, but sort of all of that, would love your views on encryption. I know you have a lot to say on it.
So the point of my question to Admiral Rogers was, we, in the tech industry, we recognize that there's a legitimate concern here from law enforcement and government intelligence agencies. Part of my responsibility is I have an e-crime team, and we spend a lot of time on child protection, and I have seen things that I will not sleep for days after I hear about, right? So we certainly are not ignorant of the risk. The problem is that we've got the government seeing a problem and then saying, let's solve it right here. And what we're asking is that I would like government policymakers to think about where do we want to be in 10 years? Because this idea that American companies are going to be trusted all around the world, and the United States will be the only country with a backdoor, or perhaps our allies, and that our bad guys won't use other technologies, they'll continue to use American technologies, that's a fantasy, right? Like all those things cannot be true. We can't stay competitive and have people use this globally and then also hold the line against other countries. If we start to build defective products, we've given up kind of a moral and technical high ground that then other countries, including ones that are not democracies, but are still economically important, might, if we open that door an inch, they could kick it in, right? And that doesn't also rely on the fact that there's a question to one of the government folks, I'm not gonna name him, last week, from a reporter, sir, can you name a single well-respected cryptographer who has publicly said you can build a backdoor without creating weaknesses in cryptography? And he said, I'm sure Silicon Valley can figure it out, which is, the answer to that is no. No well-respected public cryptographer has ever said that that's possible. And this is what is interesting, but the difference between now and the 90s. In the 90s, the US government proposed a specific way to weaken cryptography made by American companies so the US government could break it. It was immediately discovered to be full of tons of holes that would have really hurt the American economy. And so the government had to kind of run back with its tail between its legs and pull it back. And so now we have the discussion of kind of like, well, Silicon Valley can figure it out. And while we have lots of smart people, the fundamental truth is if we start to build security defective products, that's gonna have a negative impact. And it might not be worth it because honestly, our adversaries know math too, right? The word algebra is Arabic. Right? And so like the idea that American companies are the only people who can use math on the planet is very short-sighted. And the idea that the adversaries that are being tried to be caught, the people who abuse children, terrorists, foreign governments, that they're going to use our backdoored products if we were forced to create them, is just not true. And so I think if you look at the equity argument leans towards American companies building the most secure products we can, perhaps not making them as anonymous as possible. And you don't see American companies trying to build big anonymous marketplaces like the Silk Road. We're building reasonable security protections for our users, and then working with law enforcement so that they can understand ways that they can still do their job and catch bad guys without us all of a sudden giving up a huge economic advantage, which is people trust American companies up to this point to build good products.
Okay. Under Secretary Spalding, is there anything you'd like to add in response, or do you think we've covered it?
Oh, I think you've got a good sense of the arguments here.
Okay.
And again, this is not a simple matter. I think we could take the entire rest of the day talking about this. I think we've long said, those of us in cybersecurity, that there's only two kinds of companies in the world: those who have discovered they've been breached, and those who haven't yet discovered it. And it really is a reference to an advanced, persistent adversary's ability to penetrate any system. So the idea that you're going to somehow suggest that you've created something that no one could ever penetrate, I think is not accurate either. And we have always had, up till now, ways for law enforcement pursuant to judicial process or legal process with the right evidentiary standard, et cetera, to gain access to information needed to protect public safety. And it's not clear in the past that has made U.S. companies not able to compete in the marketplace. We are in a post-Snowden world. I get that. It's more complicated. But again, I think this is an important discussion that we should continue to have.
Okay.
It's not an easy one.
When we talk about lawful intercept, we need to remember that nothing has changed post-Snowden. Nothing has changed about FAA 702, Section 215, EO 12333. The United States government still believes that they can arbitrarily gather metadata from our communications, especially if it crosses borders. There has been no legal changes post-Snowden. And so that's kind of, people talk about the pendulum swinging too far. The pendulum has not swung at all. And so I don't think you can divorce the encryption discussion from the fact that the legal protections that a lot of us believe should exist for at least American citizens have not come into effect.
Okay. So let's.
Although you don't control Congress, I understand that's not.
And
But
they're,
I'd love to.
they're getting ready to debate that.
Yeah.
Right. They are. So one issue that I'd like to come back to that I think Susan and Ray raised earlier is this sort of this communications point that cybersecurity is laced with quite a bit of jargon. It's very, geeky and wonky, and both there's a communications aspect vis-a-vis corporate leadership who do not have a background in it, but then there's also a communications aspect vis-a-vis the broader populace and consumers and individual users of the internet. And so I'm sort of curious, and it's a little bit of an open-ended question about how do we communicate more effectively to raise the level of knowledge and education on these issues? And who's the right person to really send those messages? Is it private sector? Is it government? Is it John Oliver? All of the above. And so, Ray, I'd like to start with you in terms of, when you're evaluating different investments and looking at companies, looking at this again from the communications dimension, both internal and external, what are your thoughts? And I would love to move to Susan and see what she thinks as well.
Wow, open-ended for sure. Education is essential everywhere. And just as we teach health and math and reading, writing, arithmetic, we should teach good hygiene on cyber. Everybody, I'm not going to ask, but how many's changed their password in the last 30 days? Yeah, same here. It's just something that you got to do. Just like you remember where you put your car keys when you come home at night. You just got to get into the habit of that, and we should be teaching people how to do that sooner rather than later. I'm going to get back to this, measurements. We have to have some way to talk about this that isn't just laced with the gobbledygook. We just have to. A good example is the FICO score, right? Fair Isaac's personal credit rating. You go down to buy a car, you want to borrow some money, they type something in the computer and it comes back with 650 and they say, oh, well, your interest rate is, why can't we have that kind of a conversation about the readiness or the capability or the risk of a network, particularly the assets you want to protect? Because that's really important. You can't protect everything. There are a trillion targets out there. But we ought to have a language, just like we have in the credit business, just like we have in the insurance business, that talks about what these things are at a level that isn't in the gobbledygook. And I think that starts with education. I'll tell you, just a sidebar, I'm very disappointed. Computer science guys still graduating today have never had a course in encryption or even the issues of the policies. I find that reprehensible in our education system in this day and age.
Yeah. Susan, what would you like to add, and how do you think about the communications aspect of some of these issues?
Yeah, and I think it is all of the above, actually. I think we've been working with a number of companies now who are engaging sort of employees in a whole kind of culture change programs and breaking down the jargon. And I think that's actually been really effective. And people just understanding that it's a way to protect each other, and it's just something they've got to do in their day-to-day job. So I think that it kind of internal companies and their internal communications can make a very big difference. But the interesting thing is we're talking a lot about the threats of it all. But actually, companies also find themselves with institutional investors who are very interested in how they monetize data. We've just done this very interesting survey of 200 investors all around the world. And overwhelmingly, they all talk about the opportunity in data because they recognize that smart use of data can make people innovate, create new products, create new services, create efficiencies, and drive the valuation of companies. And actually, in that survey, a third of them said that they are basing their investment decisions on companies that have a real data story and a story about how they're going to monetize their data. So I think companies are also having to grapple with how they have a data narrative, a positive data narrative, at the same time as balancing it against all the threats that we've spent most of this session talking about. So again, I think it's another illustration of it's a complex world.
Okay, no, that's fair. And so to try to build on that and focus on the positive a little bit more than just the negative and all the threats that everybody's facing, I'd love to hear everybody on the panel's thoughts about what are some of the exciting new technologies that you're seeing, or where are the areas of hope, to frame it a different way, that we talk about how companies and individuals are constantly under attack from this onslaught of actors ranging from script kiddies to advanced persistent threats to you name it. But there are some really innovative, dynamic, interesting companies that are materially trying to shift the balance away from the attacker to the defender. So why don't we start with Alex and just sort of go down the line? And is there any sort of technology or approach or even company that you're seeing that you think is doing really interesting work that's worth just touching upon?
So, I mean, the two trends, of which there's a lot of companies that I think are really positive. One, mobilization and the movement to mobile operating systems have learned a lot of the lessons of the desktop PC past and have fixed a lot of security bugs. You are way safer on an iPad or an iPhone than you are on a Windows PC. And so as people use mobile devices more and more, that's actually a positive thing. And then the second, there's a real focus in industry to get rid of passwords, to make it that you don't have to take responsibility for identifying yourself to the 60 different companies that you want to interact with. And so there's a standard called FIDO, and there's a lot of startups and big companies that are building products to make, one thumbprint unlocks all your website or one thumbprint unlocks all your apps. I think that's the single biggest improvement for normal people that we'll see the next 5 years.
Okay, and just to follow up quickly, Yahoo's rolling out some new products as well, right, that add additional encryption or other security features. And do you mind briefly sort of touching upon those and
Yes.
why you're doing that?
Yeah, so on authentication, we've already rolled out a thing called on-demand password that allows you to have no password at all for your Yahoo account. Every time you add a device and associate it with your Yahoo account, we text you a one-time password. This is kind of an experiment that a lot of people have said it's less secure because it's gone from 2 to 1 factor encryption. But the truth is, you can always go reset a password, right? So authentication in a lot of ways is easy. It's account lifecycle management of what do you do when people lose their devices or lose their identity online? How do you reestablish it? That's hard. And so we're practicing with that, and then we are working on doing the same kind of thing except with biometrics using the FIDO standard.
Okay.
And we do have an open source end-to-end encryption project that we're working on with Google that soon enough, if you're on Yahoo, you can type bob@gmail.com. It will automatically find out that Bob supports encryption. It says, do you want to encrypt this message? You say yes, and your conversation is now encrypted so Yahoo or Google can't get to it.
Okay, wonderful.
So I think the silver lining of the year of the breach is that there is a growing interest in cybersecurity, both from the private sector potential victims, much greater interest in attendance at things like this, but also in people who want to make money by providing cybersecurity solutions, which is terrific. We're all in favor of Silicon Valley making a lot of money, providing cybersecurity solutions so that they continue to innovate and stay ahead of our adversaries. The most exciting thing, I think, for me that I learned when we were in Silicon Valley for the down in Palo Alto for the Cybersecurity Summit that the president held at Stanford a few months ago, was the realization that companies are coming together, some of these big cybersecurity providers, and sharing information that they used to hold very close and thought gave them competitive advantage. And that is cyber threat indicator information, and that's exactly what we're talking about in the information sharing legislation. They've made the decision that it's better to share that information, and they're out there touching millions and millions of machines because they're providing cybersecurity protection to those machines, and they get the data on all of the bad things, the malicious activity that comes through. What are the bad IP addresses sending? What does the malware look like, et cetera? They're sharing this information with each other, which provides huge situational awareness. And they're bringing in more and more companies. And we're seeing other alliances similarly pop up. And so that is very exciting because if we can really have near real-time situational awareness, right now the adversary doesn't have to work very hard. They send bad stuff in, they find a vulnerability to exploit, they can continue to exploit that vulnerability for years, for a decade or more. Because we don't get the word out and people don't take action on that information. But if we could get to a point where when the adversary tries something, that network detects it, gets it out broadly, and that's where we want to help, get it out broadly to everyone, everyone gets the word, everyone takes action on that, we can begin to envision a day when the adversary can get away with something only once.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, that will be a brave new world indeed.
Yeah.
So, just turning to you now, Ray, and Susan, to give you a chance to.
I'll be fast.
Okay,
So
take a look.
I can't cover my whole portfolio in a minute 42.
We actually have a couple. We have, I think, 2 minutes more than that, roughly. So.
But there are some interesting shifts going on. So I've been an investor for 25 years in cyber. I've done 18 deals, and there's been this massive shift in the last few years going from prevention, firewalls and things like that, to actually detection and incident response. There is an amazing amount of investment out there, and I've done a bunch of seed deals in that space. And mostly they're hunting outside on the internet. So they're looking for phishing attacks. They look for correlated data, correlated traffic, and then they can send signals back to the firewalls to shut down those IP addresses. So there's a whole bunch of startups. And by the way, those are some of our best engineers out of the NSA have started these companies because they know what offensive software looks like. They can build defensive software as well. So in the shift, the other thing, by the way, I don't think biometrics, I only have one thumbprint, and as soon as that's known to the world, I can't use it. I'd rather have a password. So I actually don't think biometrics is the way to go. And
How does somebody use your thumbprint from Russia? That's the thing.
The other thing is there's a great little company called Okta, which we just adopted. And it basically, one of the things that was tried years ago and failed because it was so complicated was controlling network access. Okta's figured out how to do that on the web. So whether I'm here and going to a GoToMeeting, I want to check I have one place, dual authentication, confirmation on my mobile phone. It's pretty slick. So it actually gives you a little bit of control on the greater internet, which is where your password gets picked off.
Well, Susan, we have, don't worry about the ticking clock, but the last word is yours.
No, I agree. I think some of the investments and things that are going on in Silicon Valley are really, really exciting. But I'm going to end on a slightly different note, which is actually changes in management approach. And I think we're seeing the start of things like cybersecurity committees as subdivisions of boards. And I think that's optimistic because it's a realization that this is a really serious issue that needs to be right at the top of the agenda. So I'm encouraged by that. And I have to say, it'll be interesting to see the day when a cyber expert becomes CEO. That's always one thing to watch out for. You know things have changed when that happens.
Wonderful. Well, do you have anything last you want to add, or we're good? Okay, well, thank you to all the panelists. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts, and thank you to the audience for attending, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Good job, Eli.
As Richard